This is Special Report.
Black holes are one of the strangest things in existence.
Neil Armstrong may have seen extraterrestrials on the moon.
When he spies a discernible shape.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
You can deny all the things I've seen, all the things I've discovered, but not for much longer. Because too many others know what's happening out there. And no one, no government agency has jurisdiction over the truth.
Welcome, greetings, hello, everybody. My name is Rob Yox. This is Full Spectrum Universe, the embattled broadcast from behind enemy lines in the once great state of New York. Welcome to another episode. We have an amazing guest tonight, one of my favorite people on this entire planet, somebody that I've sat at the feet of for quite a while in some of my research techniques and how the connections are everywhere. And he has shown me a lot of that. Tonight is Paul Wallis. And before we bring him up, let's just give him a quick bio for those of you who don't know who Paul Wallis is. And if you don't know, you're probably living under a rock, as I always say. Paul is an international best-selling author who's probed the world's ancestral narratives for their insight into human origins, human potential, and our place in the cosmos. A senior churchman, Paul served for 33 years as a church doctor, theological educator, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. He's published numerous titles on Christian mysticism, spirituality, and is a popular speaker at conferences around the world. Paul is known for his best-selling trifecta of titles in Paleocontact, the Eden series, which we're going to be talking about today, which George Norrie hailed in 2020 as Escaping Eden is this generation's Chariots of the Gods. There's much more to go on, but before we drag it all out, let's bring Paul up. Paul, how are you tonight, my friend?
G'day, Rob. I'm fantastic. Thanks so much for having me on again. And I always enjoy our conversations.
It is an absolute honor and a privilege every time you come on, because every time you come on, I feel like we get a little bit further. And with the work that you're doing now with Fifth Kind TV, you have just totally blown my mind in the fact of what you've seen. And a lot of it stems from the original book and looking into some of the usage of language between the different texts. And once we start to look at the dialogue and switch certain words when their meanings are meant to be, I guess these words have a lot of meanings, but when we look at it from certain perspectives, we get a ton of extra information, and a lot of veils are lifted on this text. And we kind of see this narrative that plays out across the world. But if you're not looking for it when you originally read a text, you could pass right by it. And I think that with the Eden series as well, it's sort of, we're going to get into what each book for me kind of is. It's a chain of events that happens, right? It's sort of a evolution of a story, and how that story is a connection on how we're all connected, but we're also connected to star families and things like that, and our galactical place in the cosmos, just like it says in your bio.
Yeah, what you've just said really beautifully describes the work I'm doing right now on the sequel to the Eden trilogy, where I'm looking at the usage of the words, keywords in the Bible, but then distinguishing that from the root meanings of the words. And so if anyone's watching The Fifth Kind on YouTube, you'll be watching some of this work happening in real time as I collaborate with the Italian scholar Mauro Biglino, and we look at a series of keywords, and we do that work sort of on screen for you so you can see what's going on. This is what you will pick up if you just read it at a surface level. Then you go back to these keywords, ask the obvious question, what do the words mean? And a whole other layer of story starts to emerge. So I'm drilling down deeper into that, showing more of the mathematics of that, so to speak, in the next book that I'm working on. And that really was my route into the whole world of paleocontact in the first place, looking at the texts of the Bible, coming from the background of a preacher and asking questions of texts that seem to tell anomalous stories, or where the stories that we tell don't quite fit the text, or where the words that we translate, there's something anomalous about the translation themselves. And that really was the white rabbit, that whole area of translation that took me down into the rabbit warren of paleocontact.
And me and Omar like to say this now, but if we're walking through a forest, we'll probably break our ankles because of all the holes that have opened up with these little white rabbit holes while we're traveling through these forests. It's pretty wild. And looking into some of the beginnings of with escaping from Eden, there is a specific word that sticks out that has many different meanings, and it truly becomes these. If you look at it with one meaning, it means one thing when you read a specific line. If you look at it with a different meaning, it means something else. So there's probably 5 or 6 different sub layers to each material piece of what you're looking at when you open up and you're looking at Genesis, right? And that ability to transfer these words, as in the Elohim, right? Basically, we're talking about the Elohim and how it can mean God, gods, angel, demon. We can go all the way down the line, and how it kind of it morphs and it creates these different stories. Because if you look at it, and let's say that we're looking at a piece of text, and you say, well, God created light, right? Or gods created light, or demons created light. So we're looking at this polarity, even within just the words themselves. And I think that is just super intriguing.
Yes, words do evolve and change their meanings. And so by the time you get to the end of the formation of the Hebrew canon, what we call the Old Testament, then you'll look at a word like Elohim, and it's getting translated as God. You look at a word like Yahweh, and it's being used to denote Almighty God, or a word like El Shaddai, it's the eternal God, the Almighty God. You find a word like Ruach, and it means the Spirit of God by the end of its journey. But at the beginning of its journey, you go to the root meanings of the words, and then look at how those words operate in the oldest texts to be found in the Hebrew canon, and you'll realize those words operate in a very different way and mean something quite different. So in the English language, in Escaping from Eden, I give an example of how a word can change its meaning. I talk about the word chapter. And so originally, in a monastic context, chapter was the chapter of the rule that you would read at the gathering of the monks in a special room once a week. And then after a while, chapter came to refer to the room in which the group of monks would gather to read the bit of the book. And then after another few hundred years, it came to mean the group of monks who would gather in the room to read the bit of the book. And then after another few hundred years, it means that any group or association of people. And so you can go to a chapter of the Mothers' Union, for instance. And so to ask, why do we say a chapter of the Mothers' Union? You have to know the story of that whole word. And if you come across the word out of context, to know whether it means a bit of a book or a group of people, you need to know when the text is, and you probably need to know the paragraph it appears in. And all these biblical words make a journey like that. And as I looked at the word Elohim, and it's funny you mentioned breaking your ankle on a rabbit hole, because that's kind of what I did. And I talk about my ultimate Frisbee injury in Escaping from Eden, laying me up for weeks on end and giving me the advantage of time to follow up on questions that often niggle people, and then you never have the time to get back to them and drill down. Well, I was very fortunate to have the time to drill down into this word Elohim. Why does it mean landlords here, demons here, false gods here, God in the singular here? How is it that this unique being of God that we all have in our minds seems to be described by a word that can describe all sorts of other things? It doesn't make sense. And then why does it carry plural verb forms and plural attributives? So I was looking into this, and I was thinking, I need more degrees than I have to get to the bottom of this. So I decided to speak to some people with more degrees than I have. Now, it'd be lovely to go to the author of the Bible and say, excuse me, but why is Elohim in the plural in Genesis 1? Why does it say, let us make the humans to look like one of us? We don't want them to be too much like one of us. Who's the us? But getting to the author of the Bible is a complex and layered issue, especially given the fact that the Bible was authored over a long period and edited and redacted. And so second best, I got to the senior editor of the New Jerusalem Bible, which is a very authoritative translation of the Bible, favored in the Roman Catholic Church. And I found the senior editor, Dom Henry Wansborough, who's a Benedictine monk who lives in Ampleforth in Yorkshire, and he's a very venerable gentleman who did a phenomenal job on the New Jerusalem Bible. And I went to him because that translation is very transparent about issues of sources and issues around the translation of words for God. And I said, look, I'm finding it hard to avoid the conclusion that Elohim is really a plural word, and that what that suggests, therefore, is that the Bible's early stories are not about God at all, but they are about a plurality of beings governing over human society in the deep past. And I had a long conversation with Dom Henry about this. And I said, why is it that the word can take a singular verb form here and a plural verb form there? And so he talked about how words change and evolve, and how you can go from a plural to a collective to a singular, and it's the same word. And he was very helpful. And as I sat with what he'd told me, I realized the implications were that in the beginning, this word was not a singular. That if it can operate as a collective noun, it's because it implies a plurality. So even when it's taking a singular verb form, it can still imply a plurality. And so that was sort of the red pill that changed my world by changing the world described by the Bible, because you put that word into the plural, and all of a sudden, the world it describes is the same as the world described by the source narratives from out of ancient Babylonia, Assyria, Arcadia, Sumeria. And those source narratives say there was a time in the deep past when human beings were governed over by non-human entities. And that sent me on a journey all around the world to discover that that story repeats in almost every culture on the planet's surface. And that was how my journey began.
It's absolutely astonishing that this repetitive story, it's basically a hand-me-down word of mouth story that gets changed through cultural perception. Let's say if you're in Asia, it's tutelaged in one way. If you're in the Native Americans, it's taught in a different way. But
Yes.
it really does culminate. And this is one of the things that I contribute to your work, is giving light for me, or giving a lane for people like me who are so enthralled and kind of matching those stories and seeing where the collaboration really begins to happen and finding those common threads. And that, I can't thank you enough for that, because we're doing a series on this channel now called Galactical Beginnings, where I'm taking research from just about everybody and anybody from before humanity to now, and finding those common threads and trying to create this like prime timeline so we can have sort of a set structure of history. And I credit that to you, because you showed me that path. So I want to say, first and foremost, thank you for showing me how that goes and how to really dig deep into those areas so I can figure out where those common grounds are. Well, they may not be read the same way. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. The common grounds are really what got my attention. The stories that repeat, the motifs that repeat. And then, of course, you have to ask why. And you use the phrase hand-me-down. Is it a hand-me-down story that has simply gone around the world sort of in Chinese whispers and changed slightly from culture to culture, but you can trace it back to one source? Or is something else going on? Well, there's a bit of that, because the Bible is a summary form of the Mesopotamian stories. So there's a bit of hand-me-down happening there, but there's something else going on as well. And what I found particularly when I got to the Popol Vuh, the Mayan account of origins, and then when I got to the Philippines and listened to the Filipino story of origins, I realized that these are not descendants of the Sumerian story. They're not a retelling. They are, in fact, a report by a different culture in different language, using different metaphor, of the same visual memory. Their ancestors saw the same thing and found a way of describing it. And so when you go to the Philippines, for instance, well, let's go to Genesis first. So Genesis says that in the beginning, and we think we're reading a creation story, but it's actually describing a planet that already exists, and it's flooded, shrouded in darkness. And then there's this account of a ruach arriving. We'll come back to what that might mean, and hovering like a hawk over the floodwaters. And it uses this word, metahefet, which means hover like a hawk. Hovers over the floodwaters, and then the terraforming, the rehabilitation of a devastated planet begins. And our distant ancestors were eyewitnesses to that. The survivors of the cataclysm were eyewitnesses, and they tell the story. Now, you can relate that to the Sumerian because I'll come back to the Sumerian. So that's the Genesis. When I got to the Popol Vuh, I was very interested that the story begins on a planet that's flooded and shrouded in darkness, and then those who engineer, the progenitors, to use the Spanish word in the text, the Spanish translation from around 1700, arrive and hover over the waters. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting. And then I went to the Philippines, and the Filipino story is of the Tagalog, the hawk hovering over the waters, and then terraforming the flooded planet using its wings to create vortices of wind to clear the land. So hawk hovering in the Philippines, hovering like a hawk in the Hebrew, and then they all speak about winds being used to separate the waters, salt water from fresh water, dry the land, rehabilitate the land. Now I go back to the Sumerian story and realize that in the Sumerian story, the process of civilization, life on Earth, begins with the four winds and the separation of waters. So having made a world tour, I can come back to the Sumerian story and realize, oh, I'm being told a little bit more than I thought I was in this very opaque, mysterious text. And that little around tour is, for instance, of how we can have something that is not just a single story that's made a journey, but different cultures saying our ancestors saw this and having a different way of describing it. And in the time since, because I made that connection when I was researching for Escaping from Eden, when I was researching Echoes of Eden, the third in the trilogy, I realized not only do you have visual memory that repeats, you have auditory memory as well. And so I talk about a sound that is recalled by different cultures that was associated with the powerful ones who governed over us in the distant past. And it was the sound that these beings would make as they approached you. And so I find that really, really fascinating to think that we are being shown things our ancestors saw, and we're being given the sounds that our ancestors heard, and then we're being given the stories and the explanations curated by our ancestors to let us know how all that fitted together.
It's like we're getting closer and closer to that 3D sort of image completely, with the sounds, the smells, the tastes, and everything, the sights, and getting there. And that's one of the things that I love about the collectings of history like that, because we are truly painting a more robust picture with every rabbit hole we go down, and how we create these connections. And because if we follow some of these entities through time as well, which is something I also love to do, we see that their demeanor changes a little between certain situations and certain civilizations because of possibly what happened before, or what happens after. But to get back to like Eden itself, and I think that the representation of Eden is tremendously important, because I can see it as a landscape, but I can also see it as somewhat of a sterile laboratory where
Yes.
nothing else is. And eventually, Enlil and Enki, of course, always at odds with each other. Enki gives the knowledge of, I guess they call it good and evil, but it could be procreation. I mean, there's so many different
Yes.
ways we can actually, kind of really digest what they're saying to us. So, I think Eden is also a very powerful story from this time period as well. And there's so many connections to be made, because if we're looking at the Bible's version of Eden, we see the same representation in other areas, maybe not taught or told in the same manner, but they create the same sort of optical vision that you would get when you're thinking in that process.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, whether you're looking at the Eden story of the Bible, or the engineering of human beings in the Popol Vuh, or the story of the creation of humankind in the Sumerian stories, you do, for instance, have the fusion of the DNA of the visitors with the DNA of the pre-humans that they're working with, and trying to fine-tune them into the kind of being they want, which is smart enough to work for them, but not so smart that they don't want to work for them. And there are bits of, it's almost now at the level of kinesthetic memory when you look at how that's described. Sights, sounds, feelings as this process goes on. And I like how you say that one aspect of Eden you could perceive as quite a sterile sort of lab situation. I think that's what's being described to us. In certain moments, we've got the memories of our ancestors pre-technology describing a technological environment and a technological process. So, for instance, in the Bible, when the man sees that there's something taken from his side, and the word doesn't mean rib, it just means a little piece of his body is taken, and something is done with it that generates a whole other human being. And what the person says, what the human says in the story is, this is flesh from my flesh, bone from my bone, is what he says when confronted with this other human being. Well, we have a word for that in the 21st century, and we call it cloning. And the idea that you could generate another human being from an existing human being, without childbirth, that you do it in this artificial way, is just mind-bending. Can you imagine the Bible translators working on that before the days of cloning and genetic engineering, which is the present? But I do think we've got descriptions of that, and the memory of that, and the wonder of it. The wonder of it is there in the Popol Vuh, where it says they came to a point in the experimentation process where they had to get beyond breeding and interbreeding, altering primates in the way that we alter dogs, to a point where there is an artificial component introduced. And again, you listen to the language that's used, and something technological is being described by a pre-technological writer. And so you've got the language of magic, and the language of supernatural, and the language of the intervention of the gods. But look at the detail of the story, and you realize what we're being told is something artificial was done to upgrade the primates from here to here. And it's really exciting. I think our ancestors curated these stories with incredible fidelity, such that we can see what they saw, hear what they heard, and now with our frameworks say, I think I understand what's going on here.
I absolutely agree. And talking about the Eden aspect of it too, reminds me of the Iroquois creation story, where they're in this place. The beginning, it's the Great Spirit and the Sky Woman, and they're in this great place of no want or need. There is no death, there is no harm, there is no ill. And the way that they come to the planet is by a hole being, well, they rip up the tree of life, or the great tree, as they call it, and there's a hole created, which could, if we're on a spaceship and we're going to transport somebody straight down, a hole in the center of the spaceship is going to open up. It's going to bring people down, and here comes the Sky Woman talking to the birds and the fish and the frogs and the muskrat. Muskrat goes down. He picks up the piece of earth, throws it on the turtle's back. Now we see the terraforming begin, which could be a submersible to grab genetics
Of
from the
course, yes.
organic genetics from the bottom of the ocean floor, bring it up, so on and so forth. So it's just so stunning how our brains can connect that now.
Yes. Now, the turtle is interesting because I think, centuries ago, we would listen to that story of terraforming, the turtle story, from the Iroquois tradition, and we would just read that as a fable. If you have seen land reclamation being done in Hong Kong, for instance, using technology, and then ask how would our ancestors describe that process? Well, they would use metaphor, and they would, just as we do, give names to the machines they're looking at. So, I mean, what is it? There's a colloquial word for a helicopter, isn't there? I mean, we used to call them whirlybirds, for instance. And the idea of giving animal names to technology is something we do. And so it's not hard to imagine that our ancestors looking at this terraforming process would say, here comes the turtle again. And they're describing something that looks like a turtle that's being used to create islands. And then 1,000 years after that, we read the word of the word turtle in the story, and we say, oh, how quaint that they think animals did this. And we don't stop and ask, is there another layer to this story? Do they really mean turtle? Just because it says turtle, are you sure it means turtle? And I think we can peel back some layers by asking some better questions of these ancient stories.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I think the work that you're doing right now with Mauro is just so imperative for us to understand what the true meanings of those specific words and how they're supposed to be implemented, and the story that's actually being told as opposed to what we perceive that story. Because a lot of when I read a story, sometimes my own perceptions get in my way, right? You know, how I see things and my mannerisms, and we have to kind of take a logical stance and pull back from that and truly
That's right.
understand.
And I think translation is the best way to do that. It's very difficult to go to a text that's been curated by a religion for thousands of years and read it without reading that religion into the text, the developed religion into the text. Or if you've been through Sunday school as a child, for instance, and you've got all this theological formation in you, it's very difficult to read the Gospels and get a sense that's different to the one that you were taught. But translation is really the key to that, to read it slowly enough that you're asking, what does each word mean? And you're going to interlinears and lexicons back to the original languages. That's the way you can unravel all these assumptions and associations. And we've just done that in the episode, me and Mauro together. We did an episode on El Shaddai, which is a word that generally gets translated as Almighty God. And that's not a correct translation at all. And the footnotes in a lot of Bibles will tell you that's an incorrect translation. Unfortunately, every time you read the incorrect translation, it rams home your concept of Almighty God, because there it is in the text. But Mauro and I say, if you go back to the root meanings, El Shaddai either means the powerful one of the mountain or the powerful one of the plain. And in fact, the way the drama plays out in the Bible around El Shaddai, I think it verifies that's what you're looking at. You're looking at a regional power, a non-human power with jurisdiction either over the mountain area or over the plains. And I won't say any more. Go and have a look at that episode on the fifth kind, and we make the case for that. But there's another possible meaning as well, which is the powerful one, the destroyer. And so now you go back to the first appearance of this entity in Genesis 17, when Abram encounters this entity. The entity says to Abraham, walk in front of me and don't put a foot wrong. And if his name means the destroyer, then you can imagine someone saying, I'm the powerful one, the destroyer, walk in front of me and don't put a foot wrong. You'll get a sense of how that relationship felt between Abram and this entity. He would have been petrified. Of course he wouldn't want to put a foot wrong. And I believe that many of our associations around Almighty God, that he needs us to be perfect, and we're better not displease him, that all that thinking, all that religious thinking goes back to this moment where somebody called Abraham, or Abram at that point, encountered a powerful entity who threatened him. And to me, that's a misunderstanding. That's not an encounter between Abraham and God. It's an encounter between Abram and a potentially violent, dangerous, frightening entity. You translate that right, and you can begin to unravel all the fear that's been sown into human beings for thousands of years around their God concept. Many people reject the whole concept of God because they think it's monstrous that we should have to live in craven fear, tiptoeing around, desperate that we don't offend, and we're in trouble if we're not perfect. And I totally understand why people reject that idea. I think it's an idea built on the experience of paleocontact, not on the prehistoric understanding of God. And so you can see how translation errors can lead to profound psychological damage, not only at an individual level, but over society, the whole way we operate as society, how we understand leadership, how we govern ourselves, how we govern other people's countries when we invade. A lot has been built on that misunderstanding. And that's something that I try to unravel, particularly in my book, The Scars of Eden and Echoes of Eden.
Absolutely, and that was kind of the segue. You took the question right from my head with the embodiment of God from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and if those translations were not correct in the way that we see God in the Old Testament as a vengeful God taking wrath on people, it changes the whole perception, and then there becomes the balance of this information that you have based on these entities and your, I don't want to say beliefs in God, but the way that I guess the way that you see God in a sense is a better way to put it. It goes a little bit
Yes.
further than that, your perspective on God. And that's kind of where going through this process, I saw a veil lift. So for me, Escape from Eden was that veil coming off. And then we get to the Scars of Eden, and that's sort of the implication of what's kind of next when that veil is completely taken away, and how you have to sit within that truth and kind of come to that connection point of the old to sort of the now, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I wrote The Scars of Eden as a way of answering the question, so what? You know, my first book, Escaping from Eden, says, does Genesis teach that the human race was created by God or engineered by ETs? Someone might say, so what? I might say, well, I'm demonstrating that it's ETs. They might say, well, so what? And Scars of Eden answers the question, so what? What difference does it make now? And what difference has it made? If our prehistoric experience was of paleocontact, how has that shaped human history? And what difference does it make to you and me in the present day? And that's really where I went with The Scars of Eden.
I love, I was listening to some interviews before we started today, just because I love to listen to you explain it. And you talk about helping people, and especially people who served in the military, seeing or going to the Middle East thinking that they're going to fight, but they're really on an archaeological expedition. And a couple of points I wanted to ask you outside of that too is, with the way that the Bible, and we see that there's a bit of prophecy with we've been seeing the Euphrates River kind of dry up, And if we're looking at what the Bible states, there are three fallen angels trapped under the Euphrates, and people have come in contact with the Euphrates drying up and been hearing chains and moaning coming from holes in the ground. What's your perspective on something like that happening?
Oh, well, that's fascinating. That's slightly outside of my bailiwick, and I'd probably need to sit at your feet on that one, Rob, and find out what you've been drilling into.
No. It was just a question because I was like, wow, we see these tales and again, they're representative of something. So it's not so much, let's say, an actuality as it is could be presented as a representation of what they believe in their perspective. So do I believe that there's actually entities under the Euphrates? Maybe not, but there's something going on down there which maybe leads to, inner Earth. And in that area, there's supposed to be a lot of reptilian activity, especially under Africa, where they've built up cities and what's left of the reptilian race on this planet. And people are going to say, oh, that's kind of out there. But we know for, damn near certain that there are reptilians that are roaming the earth. So it's a lot of stories. But getting back to the gentlemen who were serving and finding themselves out in the middle of in the Middle East, and now they're sitting here trying to find specific artifacts that maybe were, for those people, how was that a drastic moment for them when they had their perceptions changed? And when their perceptions changed, how did that affect them moving forward from that point?
Mm. Well, going to war really is a traumatizing experience for anybody. And many come home from theaters of war with PTSD, and the PTSD can unravel them. It can unravel their families. It can be very, very profound. Some are able to find ways to manage it and continue their careers, go into other theaters of war, and some can't. But I think you would find a very small proportion of people who haven't been profoundly affected and harmed psychologically by their engagement in warfare. So that all on its own is enough to leave people with a lot to process. And they want to know why. Why did I risk my life? Why did I risk the life of my men? Why did I lose so many of my comrades? What was it about? You'll ask that question after any engagement in war. And it's profoundly disturbing if the why that you come up with is a small why, or a why that has nothing to do with the safety of your home country or the freedom of the world, because that's always, the big ticket, isn't it? You're going to save the world by going to war against this evil power, whatever it might be. Save the world from weapons of mass destruction, or save the Kurds from being genocided, and so on and so forth. And then you get there and you find out this isn't about that. This is about corporations wanting possession of assets and resources. And even that, discovering that the reasons are here rather than here, can be very difficult to process, because you're risking your life for a private corporation. You're risking your life for natural resources exchanging hands from one wealthy family to another wealthy family. This was the kind of trauma that people had to deal with when they came back from the Crusades in the Middle Ages, to discover they'd not been on a holy war at all. And if you want to get an insight on how profound PTSD can be, then read the story of Francis of Assisi. Read the story of his generation, because many of the structures of mainstream society lost a whole generation of person power because of the Crusades, because of people who have been traumatized by war and suddenly realized their place in the world was totally different to what they thought it was. That they were all just pawns whose lives were totally expendable for the sake of moving wealth around from one family to the next. And the impact on medieval Europe was phenomenal. And we've only really seen a shadow of that in what we saw following Korea and Vietnam, for instance. But on top of those layers, I found people who came to me from their experience in Iraq were coming not only with all that to process, but realizing that what they were there for was top secret. And as you say, had to do with archaeology. And so drilling down into the why did we go? Why did we invade that country? Why did we lose so many comrades? Why did we kill so many civilians? And find that the answer has to do with archaeology that none of us are allowed to mention. Well, you can't stop there. You have to drill down further into the why. And so I've heard from a number of people who went over and found that their unit was there to requisition artifacts and uplift them from Iraq, get them to either Israel or the USA. And they'll often ask me, do I know the bigger picture? Do I know what was the technology that we were looking for? What do I know about stargates? What do I know about portals? Why would we be boxing up huge volumes of sand and shipping them out of the country? Because these people have to get to the why. Why were we there? What was it all about? And pretty quickly, you can go from those questions of why in Iraq to what's special about that part of the world. What's hidden in that part of the world? What are the stories from that part of the world? That takes you immediately to the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian cultures, and to the stories they curated, to the technology they reference, and to the stories of contact that they hold. And that's what brings a lot of these people to me, so that I can help them put those pieces together so that they've got some handle on why we were there, what we were looking for, why we were looking for it, why it's top secret, why it was so important that within days of that incursion into Iraq in 2003, we were looking for these things.
I totally agree with you with the PTSD part, and actually the abductees go through a set of PTSD type standards too when they come back, and people don't believe them. And I know you tell the story about the people who were on the coast who there was an underwater base next to where they lived, and they would get abducted for 2 or 3 years time. And I remember you telling me that. And actually today, I had a friend that we do a thing on Clubhouse, and he was originally from Nigeria. And I asked him, I said, listen, I know somebody who tells a story about abductees being out, out of Africa. In the towns in Nigeria, is there any local stories that you've heard that would make you feel that somebody may have or could potentially have been abducted? And he said to me, he goes, he said, like, oh, it's pretty wild, because I was actually just talking about this a few days ago. He says to me, he says, in Nigeria, there's specific towns that they believe are portal towns, where if you reside within those towns, and something about leaving and coming back, you'll leave and not come back for 3-4 weeks at a time. People go missing all of the time, and they call them dark towns because they believe it's dark portals that's taking them away. And then when they come back, they seem to be completely different, completely rearranged. And that goes back again to I didn't hearing this, and listening to what you've told about your story. I feel like there's some sort of negative entity using portal technology to regain these people and bring them back. Not the same as if it could be, a hybrid type of program, but these people seem to be very distraught when they come back in a bad way, not in a good way. So it would make me believe that there was a negative entity doing the same things in Nigeria that can be found all throughout small towns in Africa, South America, even the United States.
Well, I think we have a spectrum of company, and I think that the technology to abduct and interfere with human beings is probably in the hands of quite a spectrum of our neighbors. I was surprised in my research for the Scars of Eden at how many abduction narratives carried by cultures around the world report it in a more benign way than that, who say that people return from these experiences and they are traumatized to an extent because they've been taken to somewhere that they didn't understand and they've not been able to contact their family for 3 years, and now they've been returned and no one's going to believe them. So that's traumatizing enough. But many of those people will say, well, actually, I quite like the people who held me for 3 years. I was not happy I couldn't contact you, but actually they were quite nice to me and they looked after me. And that is the main story that I've heard as I've looked into the abduction experience, ancient and modern. But then there are more frightening and traumatizing kinds as well. So I think the interest in us is from a range of neighbors. The technology of portals is probably in the hands of a range of neighbors, so on and so forth. But it's funny, I after I published Escaping from Eden, I was talking to my parents-in-law and discovered that we're very closely connected with another family that had one of these abduction experiences. The daughter went missing for 3 years and then reappeared, and it was a mummy water experience. And I was blown away to think this experience was that close to me. It was part of what motivated me to go around the world and gather some of these stories. And then I was talking to another family just recently, and they'd been discussing my videos, and in particular the Mami Water stories. And this family was talking about it as if it was an interesting idea. And then one member of the family said, have you completely forgotten about Aunt May? Aunt May? And suddenly, as a group, they retold the story of Aunt May, which is only, a generation before, who went missing for 3 years, came back, said she'd been abducted by the people who have a base under the sea, and she was physically different. She'd lost all her eyelashes, for instance, and every so often her eyes would go rather strange and then start watering. And she always wanted to be near the water. She would often go down to the water, and the family would say, oh, she's going to worship the spirits of the water. And that's how the family told the story. As they retold it now, they realized she wasn't going down to worship the spirits of the water. She was going down to try and connect with what happened to her in that underwater base, to connect with the people who took her and held her for 3 years. And I tell that story because that story was in this family and had been forgotten until they sat down and talked about it. Forgotten because it was something they didn't know how to process and had therefore not spoken about. And so in all my books, I hope to encourage people to tell their own stories of the strange and mysterious, stories of things they've experienced that they can't explain, even if it's only a fragment of a memory of something that happened, to tell those stories and just see what it flushes out. Someone else in the group is going to say, well, let me tell you what happened to me. And bit by bit, as a friendship group or a family circle, you will join some dots. You will see there's a picture here that says there's more going on than we commonly talk about. This world is more interesting than we commonly acknowledge. I had a friend of mine who I've known for many years, and I don't want to give away who it is, but I'll say he's a fellow pastor, and he'd been reading my Eden books. And I think it was when I just put out Scars of Eden, and he went to visit his dad, who's met me a couple of times. And his dad said, oh, what's Paul doing these days? And so my friend said, oh, it's quite interesting, actually. He's writing about paleocontact, and these are his books, these are his ideas. And his dad didn't say anything. He just got up from his seat, and he went to a cupboard, and he got down from a top shelf this box, opened up the box, and pulled out these drawings. And he said to his son, my friend, these are the drawings your grandfather made in the 1950s after he experienced a close encounter. So there's another example of a story in a family that had been almost forgotten simply because it wasn't spoken about, because the family didn't know how to process it. And I think what happens in families happens in society at large, that sometimes we forget about things that we don't know how to process, or that we don't want to think through the implications of what happened. And I think taboo is very destructive and very negative, and can make us easy to manipulate. And so in Escaping from Eden, Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, I really am continually bursting that bubble to break the taboo and encourage people more and more to say, let's talk about our cultural memory. Let's talk about our family memories. Let's talk about your experiences and mine, and let us go looking for the memory that our indigenous peoples have carried at the folkloric level for thousands of years, and think through the implications of what we're finding.
Matt, to bring it to the indigenous as well is just it's so true, because their stories are sacred in a sense that they're passed down specifically to people who are selected because of the consistency in which it has to be told for them to kind of reside within what they believe. And so much so that if people don't recite them properly, it could be punishable by death in some of the indigenous cultures if you don't, give the
Yes,
exact example, because it holds that much importance.
that's exactly right. I mean, I think we have been in mainstream society entrained, programmed to look down on indigenous story. It's just story, it's just fable. To look down on local folklore. Oh, it's old wives' tales. How can you take any of that seriously? That's our start point. And what you said is really important, Rob, because indigenous story has been preserved so faithfully. In some indigenous cultures, the stories are maintained from generation to generation by guardians who will be trained to tell the stories. And if they depart from it one iota, they'll get beaten up. Because the idea is you cannot do that. This is sacred. This is the story. You don't change it at all. And so the idea that folklore is Chinese whispers, who knows what the folklore originally was, that kind of attitude, you put that right away. These stories have been curated with phenomenal fidelity. And even if they seem strange and metaphorical, that's no reason to disrespect them. It's a reason to ask very interesting and careful questions of them, to find out what is the information that's been curated through the ages in this way.
And it's told with such a embodiment of spirit itself, that you can feel the energy of the story as well with the way that they tell it. They're literally trained or taken apart from their tribe to make sure that they understand the essence of the story or the recanting of it, so it gives you that. It's like when the hairs stand up on the back of your neck when they tell you a story. It's that kind of energy that goes along with it. And I think that, that's one of the
Yes,
things that me and you absolutely love. And I think that the recanting of these stories might be the most accurate, as per, well, not, they use metaphors and symbolism, but because of, like you said, because of that, you know, importance that they've put on it, that it's actually told word for word through generation, that it's probably our most accurate recanting of the symbol history as we see it, right? And to me, one way, but I love those stories too, because even the ones in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we find the similarities yet again. And some of these people lived oceans apart, and this is another way that we tell people there's an ulterior, motive and entity working behind the scenes to connect these people. And, I think that
definitely.
my favorite, those are my favorite, because of the way that they're symbolized too, and how they use what's around them expression of what they're talking about. So when you're looking to what they were meaning by it, you don't have to look too far from their actual surroundings to kind of make those connections or create those similar paths, I guess is the best way to say it.
True. And I knew I had to go to indigenous story when I wrote Echoes of Eden, because by the time I'd got to the end of Escaping from Eden, I had to acknowledge that it was indigenous story around the world that had most faithfully curated the memory of paleocontact. And that if I wanted to understand what that paleocontact meant, I needed to listen to the elders and the shamanic traditions of our indigenous peoples. And I was also very intrigued to realize that if there's a different story of origins, then there's a different story of human potential today. And that these same indigenous traditions have always maintained shamanic and mystical protocols for heightening our consciousness, our intelligence, switching cognitive powers on that have lain latent for generations. And I thought, there's a connection there. There's a connection in the story. It's an implication of a different story of origins, but they've also belonged to each other in these cultures around the world. So I knew I had to go back to the indigenous traditions and ask them some more probing questions, which is what I do in Echoes of Eden. And as I did that, it made sense to me why, through the ages, the powers of empire have always been against indigenous culture, shamanism, initiation culture, why they wanted to stamp out the information that these cultures have carried, and why they wanted to stamp out these protocols that get passed on through initiation from generation to generation. It's really all of a piece, and it's not just about controlling the narrative. It really is about controlling the people, having a population that you can manage. You don't want other sources of power or information. You don't want grassroots empowerment if you are a top-down government. And is there any other kind? And so I began to join the dots and realize that this story of who we are and what we're capable of is a continuous story, continually suppressed, continual attempts to wipe it out, and yet continually it survives and is there for us to return to and tap if we really want to know how we can have a better human experience.
I totally agree with that too. It's that fear-based mindset. It's when they keep people from understanding their lineage, whether it be whitewashed away or retold in a different way to change specific aspects of it. They do that because a man or a woman who doesn't know where they come from is a man or a woman lost. And we say that a lot on this show. And having those connections and being able to basically look at your line and bring it up to the and where you come from gives you this gravity to you that kind of gives you more of an understanding of what your peoples were and what you are, and that kind of gives you an understanding of the potentials to move forward, that's why I truly believe the Eden series is an evolution, because you've basically gone and changed or ripped the veil off and looked at the sub layers of the story, and then you took on this. So what about it? And now we're looking at the connections with what it means to reside within that subsection of the story. And now we're looking at the potential of, if we move forward in a sense, while looking back a little, we can see what we're destined to become. And I think that that's truly just a full evolution in all the books. And to me, it's been just an amazing journey to watch you do this work, but also I got to be a part of the third book, but just to really reside within what you were telling and having it empower me, because information is that activation, and it's empowered me to move forward and figure out even into the galactic areas and to figure out what's even further. Where do we go from here, and how do we manifest what we want moving forward from here?
Yes, well, you've got a very well-deserved place in Echoes of Eden, Rob, because you were so helpful to me as I was in the research phase of Echoes of Eden, and you introduced me to a mutual friend who shared his story of initiation in a way that helped me to get a handle on what I was writing about and why I needed to go where I was going. And I think when you have a personal contact with someone who embodies one of these traditions, it really can be life-changing, whether you're doing an initiation ceremony with them or you're just sitting at their feet and realizing not only is this person telling a story, they're part of it and they embody it. And I've been very fortunate to have some experiences like that where I've come into contact with people who have been changed either because of traditional initiation, they are a guardian of an indigenous people group, or because they've been changed by an experience that is out of the ordinary, that's not part of our core curriculum. And I have a number of stories like that in all three of the books, but there's a fellow I'll mention. Well, there are a number I could mention in Echoes of Eden. There's my friend Lionel Friedberg, who has just this incredible visceral description of what happened to him when he went to traditional healers in Zambia, and there was another country he went to as well. And his life was changed by those encounters. And just sitting at his feet and listening to him tell the stories, you feel the energy of all that happened. You can feel the energy of a man whose life was changed by it, and then you're changed by that experience. Or there's a guy I call Sean in Echoes of Eden who had an abduction experience which included being introduced to his baby, a hybrid baby. And if that sounds far out, let me tell
It's
you,
happening.
for instance, that in the 1990s, the US Defense was researching these experiences, but only those experienced by US military personnel. So that tells you how prolific the experience is. Well, I got talking to Sean, who was part of US Defense, who had one of these experiences, abduction, introduced to a baby who was his hybrid baby. And the trauma for him of that experience was not just being pulled out of his conventional 3D world and thinking, oh my goodness, in whose company are we living? But he came back and has had to live with this kind of grief that he doesn't have contact with his child. And I tell his story because this is something I've heard and felt as I've spoken to people who've had abduction experiences, that one of the hardest things to live with is the understanding that you have children that you are never going to see, but who are real and who exist, but they're not living here on our planet. And to have that experience and to have that grief, and then not to be able to talk about it because everyone's going to laugh at you if you say such a thing, that is hard. And that takes a lot of processing. And even though I've had people come to me so that I can help them with their processing, which I hope I do, it changes me in the process. And it's made me feel all the more committed to this path of research, because I think so many people have been shamed into silence and have remained silent for fear of ridicule, and have had to carry on their own experiences that are life-changing, either for the good or for the bad. They don't know what to do with the experiences. And I think it's just horrible that we do that to one another. It's hard enough to have the experience, but then not to be able to talk about it, then to believe everyone will think you're mad if you mention it, and not know that you are one of millions. That's ridiculous. And that's why we have to break the taboo. That's why we have to have these conversations, because it's just unfair that we do that to one another. And as soon as we realize how prolific these experiences are, potentially, I think that really does change how we live on the planet. if suddenly we realize we've got company, we're in company, and that contact is possible, the implications of that are enormous. Geopolitical implications, economic implications. I mean, it was the geopolitical and the economic implications that gave Ed Mitchell the courage he had to continually challenge the US government to come clean on its knowledge about contact with other civilizations. And he did that while bound by layers and layers of official secrets laws. So he really was taking it to the edge when he said those things. But one of his major motivations in doing that was, how different would the world be if we were not beholden to the few families who control the world's oil or own the world's power industries, so on and so forth? Or if all that's gone because we've got free energy, then how much of our politics changes because our politicians are all run by these corporations and these elite families? It would be a different world if we could know about the technology that's available to us and know about the help that's available to us through the company that we truly have.
I absolutely agree, and I think this world would be so different, so different that it would be hard for us to actually materialize what that would look like in our minds at this moment, right? We're sitting here and we're thinking about it. We're like, yes, that's what we want. But do we really understand the full implication of it? It's going to be a completely radical change from what we have now. The government is lobbyists, and those lobbyists control everything in a sense with their money. So it's really it's a wild, a vicious cycle. And you're right. We have to create these tapestries of community where we can engage in this sort of interaction, because not only does this interaction alleviate some of those pressures, like your friend who had a tremendous weight on his shoulders, thinking that not only is he having a paternal sort of mentality towards an entity that he has fathered, he'll never have that connection to basically to truly, substantiate as he moves forward. So there's a lack in that moment, and being in the community, at least being able to share it, it was not going to alleviate all of it for sure, but it's going to give somebody maybe a stability that they can keep saying it until it becomes a little bit lighter, because there is an exchange of energy when we interact with each other on that level. And I think that
Definitely.
it's absolutely important. Go ahead. Sorry.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's why this is a great time to be alive, because we can find each other through the internet and through work like yours, Rob. People find each other and say, oh, you've had a similar experience. It is life-changing suddenly to realize that you're one of many who's had this experience, or who's seen this thing, or who's come to this perception. We're very fortunate that we can find each other this way through the internet. And a generation ago, it was not possible. And even now, I have people contacting me, describing their close encounter experiences, thinking they're the only one to have had this experience. And can I believe such a thing? Have I ever heard such a thing? Well, so I'm glad that that is changing. And then beyond that, it is great to find each other in this kind of community. And from time to time, you will actually make a friend through this kind of community, as I've made a friend with you, Rob. And
Absolutely.
it gives you such, not just reassurance, it gives you energy to have a connection at a human level with someone who is in your same world. Gives you energy to deal with whatever the therefores are of your situation or your experience. Gives you the energy to say, well, I want to look into this. I want to understand what's going on. I want to find out what's out there. Whereas when you're isolated, you don't necessarily have any of that energy to say, oh, I've peered into another world. I want to find out what's in there. You're more likely to shrink back into yourself and not want to think about these things. And that's the trauma sort of response.
It definitely is. And again, the exchange of ideas too, and sort of refining what we know to create like I said, to create that timeline primed so we can understand better with. And one of the things that I always talk about in this specific community is that we have to keep an open mind. We can't, no matter what we talk about, even if it's past histories, right? Because some perceptions on history can be different through cultural upbringing or different, different portions of. We could have 50 different people read the same thing, and it's going to be given back to you 50 different ways. But it doesn't mean we can't all learn from those perspectives and have a more robust understanding of the entirety of what everybody saw, because it a lot of it is through eyewitness account, a lot of it is through stories, and this is why people don't like coming forward, because they feel that ridicule, because it's hard to substantiate some of the claims that people make. And if you take everything at face value and at least listen and give it a moment before you either act or react, you'll see that there's similarities in all of these, all of these connections that are being made. And it's funny because I was a person who never had any contact ever until we started working on disclosure. I saw a craft in the sky. It took off, disappeared. I was with my wife. Then I was outside with my wife again just 3 weeks ago. And we're watching this, what looks like a star go across the sky. And it goes from a pinhead, and it explodes to about the size of a dime with a white light. And then it goes about 10 seconds and it's gone. And I was just like, holy cow. So I've been watching this sky. And at 5 a.m, if I go outside, sure as anything, it looks like a star is traveling across the sky really fast. And I've see this pattern now. And I'm like, so now I try and get outside at 5 a.m. every day to try and see if I can see some sort of contact. It's been overcast for like a week here, and I've been getting upset. Like, hey man, I want to see my friends up there. Like, let me see it. But there's been a lot of different things that are happening within the community because of these veils being lifted and because of the information that's coming forward, that I believe that the entities that are usually in hiding are making themselves more readily available for people to either have contact with or at least see them from afar.
Yes, I think that's right. I was talking to some friends the other day, and the lady I was talking to had lost her spectacles, and she'd been looking all over the house for them. And it wasn't a huge house. There weren't that many places these specs could be or could have fallen. They were moving furniture and moving cushions and moving everything to see, have they fallen down somewhere? And by the time they looked absolutely everywhere, she thought, okay, I'm going to pray about this. And so she just sent up a prayer, wanting to find her specs. And as soon as she had finished her prayer, she turned around and looked at her dad, and he was wearing her specs. And he hadn't noticed he'd got the wrong specs on. And I tell that story because in all the time they'd been looking for the spectacles, he had been wearing them. She would have looked at her dad many times during that search. Why didn't she see them? And it's because we see what we expect to see. And it's our brain's job to filter out, the vast majority of information coming to us so that we just get given the relevant stuff. And that's how this happens. We see what we expect to see. She saw her dad's face. It looked pretty much she expected it to look. He usually has specs on. Yes, he's got specs on. Nothing to see here. And I missed the fact it was a different pair of specs. And so I think sometimes I share that story because there is a bias to just seeing the familiar. And I think, again, we have to give each other the courage to see what we actually see, to register if we're looking at something that's not normal, that's not right, that we don't have an explanation for. We actually have to be proactive to see things for ourselves or help others see them. And very often there's a very strong programming not to see things. So if you've, for instance, got a very strong belief that there's no spiritual realm or there are no other dimensions, then you will not notice the shadows moving through your rooms, for instance. You just won't see them. And as soon as you are open to the idea of other entities, other dimensions, spirits, then you'll notice the shadows moving through your rooms. Then you'll notice your animals responding to things you can't see, so on and so forth. Then you'll notice the things in the sky that isn't how the sky usually works, is it? But we actually have to release ourselves and permit ourselves and then encourage one another to see what we see, and then, even braver than that, to say what we saw.
I think that's a very profound thought too. It's heavy inundated programming that kind of makes us not see a lot. And I think that being within the community gives us a little bit more of a perspective to kind of drop down that guard. And I wanted to ask you a question, and this is not in the sense of what you think they mean, but writing these three, what did that mean to you spiritually? Was it like a great relief once getting all this information out and you've put it? Explain to us what that felt like for you.
Yeah, I think a great relief is a really good way to describe it, because it started with the realization that we've run with a very distorted idea of what God is and a very distorted idea of who we are. And the Bible is full of clues pointing to that. And so, as someone who'd been preaching from the Bible for 33 years, training pastors in how to interpret the Bible, I had that awareness for a long time, sort of in fragments. And so to bring the fragments together and realize there's a key piece of the puzzle that makes sense of this, and it's that many of these stories are not about God at all, they're about something else. It was a huge relief to resolve that picture for myself, but then also to share it with others, because it was just too important to me to keep as something, I happen to know, because this distorted image of God is so destructive in people's lives. I mean, to live tiptoeing around lest you offend the Almighty by not being perfect. I mean, that really is how a lot of people live. And if they don't, they're having to suppress that thought because that's been their programming from parents and school and church. And so I felt I have to set people free from that if I know that that's all built on false assumptions and false translation. So it was a dual layer of relief. I've resolved the picture for myself. I think I now understand what's going on in the Bible. This is why the God of the Old Testament is so different to the God and Father of Jesus. This is why the God of the Old Testament is so awful and violent. It was a relief to be able to say that, see it, realize there's a coherent picture here, and then a relief to share it. And then, as I say, it left other things unresolved, loose ends that I just had to pursue. I felt a bit of a closure when I got to the end of Echoes of Eden, because I feel that the three books together, Escaping, Scars, and Echoes, they're almost like a 360-degree view on the implications of this key information. And so I felt another sense of relief when I got to the end of the trilogy. Now, of course, I'm in the writing process again, and I realize I've got to go to this territory of the hidden stories. And really, my goal with the next book is really to show show the mathematics, show the working, show the credibility of these conclusions for an even wider audience than has read the Eden books. And I think my hope is always to get to a wider audience, to be a gateway guy for people into these topics who would never consider it otherwise. And so, yes, there's a sense of relief, but I still feel very driven at the same time. And I still feel there's much more for me to do to open this topic up, to keep it on the table, to keep people talking about it, to permit more and more people to get into this and make these discoveries and make journeys of exploration for themselves.
I appreciate that more than you know, because I felt like within reading those books, it has sort of fine-tuned my ability to kind of look into those areas and make connections. So for me, I'm excited, and I look forward to more books too. And I have another question for you that Omar wanted me to ask. He's out there watching, and it is, let's see, let me find it real quick, and it is about I'll find it in a second. But so, I feel like we've kind of come full circle here, and you've given it a very good a robust understanding of the implications of how, when things change, it moves forward. And one of the things I always ask everybody before we finish is, I'm going to ask you in a moment or so what you think people need to hear now. I know we're sitting on a precipice in this moment, and I want to make sure we take the time to acknowledge that too, because we're moving towards this moment in time that I believe has happened already in the sense of cyclistic in history, but we're at that precipice again, and we're trying to maneuver our way to pass that control to that investment in spirituality and consciousness. And I think it's going to be relatively soon that we're going to be right over that cusp. But we've been talking about it for a while. And, especially with the Strongs, and we're talking about the equinoxes and how there's going to be that great separation if we're looking at what the Hopis say. I think that we're kind of on that mode. We're already in that separation mode, if that makes sense. Does that what is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it does make sense. I have a similar feeling, although as a caveat, when I was very, very young, I remember listening to the Fifth Dimension singing, "This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius." And so when I was tiny, people were saying this. And so a pivot can last a little while. But I do have that feeling, and I think that what I want to say is I hope that we're at the end of that pivot, and that we're in a place where we can shape a better human experience, where we can decide collectively that we want a better experience than this, that we're not going to plunge ourselves into more of the age of authority, where most of us are plebs doing as we're told and believing as we're told, and the elites just kick back and enjoy the benefits of beautiful planet Earth. We don't want more of that.
No.
We want to be more alive, more healthy, more conscious, more empowered. We want to be tapping all the knowledge that humanity has carried with it for thousands of years and not have that intimidated out of us. So I'm absolutely all for that. But just in case this pivot is a little bit of a longer pivot than we might like, I would say it's especially important, therefore, that we be very, very conscious about our frame of mind, our emotional health, the energy out of which we operate. And this is why I was talking earlier about how important it is that we encourage one another and that we meet one another in whatever way we're able to, that we listen to each other and affirm one another, because there is so much out there that could pull us into a funk of hopelessness. I mean, I don't want to get too political here, but there are probably many political figures around the world that you could look at, political leaders, and think, oh, what hope is there? What hope is there if these are the people running the world? What hope is there if the elites behind the scenes are able to control democratic countries like this? What hope is there if these corporations still have this power? What hope is there if the resources of the world belong to a fraction of the 1%? How can I change any of that? It's very easy to fall into a funk of hopelessness. And if we do that, then we're not going to pivot in the direction we want to pivot. And that's why we have to be very, very proactive about our state of mind. what we think about, the energy with which we live our lives, the emotional state we allow ourselves to live in, the input we make to one another. We need to be the positive force. We need to carry the energy that will pivot us in a good direction. And this is why the one another of communities like the community that gathers around you, Rob, or Omar, I know you're listening, the community that gathers around you is so important. And when you go to a conference or a summit that's hosted by Full Spectrum Universal, Watchers Talk, or Our Alien Ancestry, very often, if you listen to the comments, people will say, I love the energy of this conversation. I love the energy of this crowd. And that is really important. It's not just some woo-woo thing to say that has nothing to do with the actual information that's coming across in a conference. No, it's actually really important that we find ourselves in those energetic hotspots and that we encourage one another to be in that energetic place, and that we find things in our own lives and lifestyles that helps us to maintain that level of health and energy. Now, I get that from the sunshine. I get that from deep breathing. I get that from grounding and earthing. I get that by going to the beach. I get that from being in nature. I get that from having conversations like these. And I need to be very, very proactive that I'm doing all those kinds of things. I get it by eating a little bit lighter. And I need to do those things because with the work I do, it's very easy to get into a funk. If you read Echoes of Eden, there's quite a lot of dark history in that book. And the only way I could get through researching that and writing that book was by being very proactive about looking after my energy. And so I think I would make that my my message for the day. It may seem tangential to everything we've talked about, but actually how we are as human beings is very much more down to deliberate acts, deliberate decisions on our own part than we often realize. And I think it's empowering to realize that you can choose the state in which you're going to live. Can't choose your circumstances, can't choose your family, as they famously say, but you can learn to operate yourself as a human being, as a human body. And I think being at a level of high energy, high motivation, interest, appetite, excitement, do everything you can to stay in that spot, because the more of us are in that spot, then the more likely it is that this pivot is going to be shorter rather than longer, and is going to take us in a higher rather than lower direction.
I think everything you said is 100% accurate in the sense that it is that exchange, and we do have to be mindful. And I've actually just explained it on the last episode. We talked about something very dark, but it has to be known and said. So I prefaced it with, I'm not lending my energy, just by the actual affirmation of saying, I'm not going to let this get to me. And while you see me start to not get mad or enraged, but sort of like almost disgusted with what I had to say at the time, I still was guarding myself to not go off the deep end and have it
Yeah.
consume me with that. So it is absolutely important. And that's how we mediate ourselves. And we can do that every moment of every day. It goes with the retraining of the subconscious and making sure that you're always looking for the positive as opposed to straying towards the negative. And I think that is an absolute mental exercise once it gets done. And it truly is profound when it happens like that. So I did find Omar's question, and he asks, what role did alien play in suppressing human extrasensory abilities? And if yes, how?
Oh, well, Elion is a word in the Hebrew scriptures that refers to the commander or the president of the Sky Council.
A council of seven.
In the part, well, in the Bible, the Sky Council refers to a body that mediates the various factions, non-human factions, who seem to think they've got a stakeholding in Project Earth. So it goes beyond a group of 7 or a group of 9. It's a bigger group than that. How big it was in the days of the Bible, I'm not sure, but Elion was the name or title given to the commander of the powerful ones. And I think that if we relate the biblical story to the Sumerian story, Elion could very well be the Enlil character in the Sumerian stories. And Enlil is the character who has jurisdiction over this region of space. His, let's get this right, his younger brother has jurisdiction over Project Earth and Project Humanity. And it's the younger brother, Enki, who wants to upgrade human beings for a better human experience. And Enlil says, no, we don't want that. So making that parallel, it would seem that the Elion character is someone who doesn't want us intelligent, doesn't want us informed. And what that translates into in the present day, well, I would say that our ancestors have given us some stories to prepare us for what that kind of being kept in the dark might mean, or what being dumbed down might mean. And so the Popol Vuh and the Efik story from out of Nigeria encourage us to make sure that our environment is clean of toxins, and that our diet is as pure of toxins as we can get it, because then we are at our smartest, we're at our brightest intellectually, we're at our healthiest physically. And then if you go to another story, oh, I forgot what I was going to say. So environment is one of those things. And another is the fear, of course, that if we are overwhelmed by things in our own life, if we're fearful of the world that we're living in, if we're overwhelmed and overstressed by a pattern of work, well, that dumbs us down as well. And certainly I think you can see at different times in history that's been done very cynically and very deliberately. So you need to look out for that as well. Another mythology that I found very helpful is an ancient story called Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe. And I think that there's a really profound insight to take from that movie, and that is that when an emperor comes in who wants to have the freedom to govern without accountability, he simply provides more entertainment for the masses. And I think that's something we need to be careful of as well. It's something we're especially vulnerable to in the days of social media, more so, I think, than in the days of television. It's so easy to be distracted by the things the algorithms want you talking about. And I think you really need to be careful of that. Ration yourself on that front. Please don't feel the need to comment on anything that the algorithms are putting in front of you. You decide what you want to think about from day to day. Thank you very much. Because I think if the emperor could do that in Gladiator and distract a whole population just by periodic shows, gladiatorial contests, how much more can the powers of today do that through algorithms? So I think pay attention to your environment in that sense as well, your mental environment, your physical environment, how much you are in nature, how much you're in a soup of electronics and radio waves, what you're eating, what you're drinking. Take care of all of that, because there are levers that someone like Elion can pull to try and push you into a space where you've just not got the time, energy, or mental health to think about things. But I think if we live proactively, then we can allow ourselves the energy to enjoy life and to think about things.
I totally agree. Living in the way of consciousness is not just it's not just a choice, it's a process. It's a process throughout your entire being, and every fiber of your being has to be on board, because it does come with a lot of responsibility of maintaining specific aspects of yourself that have to be at close to 100% as you could possibly get it, because then it'll
Definitely.
put you in tune.
And I mean, if you do a ceremony like Plato did with his Kaikion ceremony 2,500 years ago, and came away from that experience with insights that have equipped humanity in the 2.5 millennia since. If you do a ceremony like that, and they're still available around the world, you will always have to fast first. So you'll always have to clean up your diet, and generally you'll have to avoid medications for a period as well. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm against medication. I'm just pointing out that cleaning up what you're ingesting before a ceremony is part of the ceremony. And therefore, if you want anything like the acuity that you have in an initiation ceremony or an interdimensional contact ceremony, then yes, pay attention to what you're ingesting. Pay attention to what you're eating. Pay attention to the supplements that you're taking, so on and so forth. And as I say, I'm not anti-medication. You might need to look at what foods you're eating, because your foods might be arguing with your pills, so that your pills can do the job they're supposed to do. But just pay attention to what you're taking into your body, because that is something you can control. And then to an extent, you can control environment. We can never get away from internet, electronics. The whole planet is in a soup. Nevertheless, you are better off taking a walk through a forest than through, the cityscape of a downtown city. There's some freedom. I always feel better when I go for a walk in the forest. I always feel better when I go for a walk around the lake, go down to the beach. These are things we can actually be proactive about, that have an impact on our state of being. And I found, prior to writing Escaping from Eden, that prioritizing that was really, really important to getting me into a place where I actually had the clarity to think new thoughts and to change my mind about things. Whereas prior, stressed out with work, emergency eating, emergency sleeping, everything's on that survival mode, there's no way you're going to think fresh thoughts and think your way into a new life when you're in that situation.
I totally agree. I'm actually going to Saratoga Springs. While we're going to be attending a concert at night, during the day, we're going to find a trail to walk through in the springs. And I may go barefoot. I'm not sure yet. But the springs are supposed to be naturally active with minerals and natural antibacterials and things like that. So I'm super psyched for it. And, it's just been after this, I feel like I'm right in the mode to just absorb it all. But again, I think next time you come on, Paul, I think we should do a whole episode dedicated to Plato, because Plato's works are just it's so magnanimous with everything that we talk about, and it's so important. But again, I don't want to keep you too long today. This has been another amazing episode, my friend. I love talking with you. You're one of my favorite people on this planet to talk with, because when you talk, the ideas just keep coming to me. And I just want to say it's always an honor and a privilege. And I thank you for coming on tonight. It's always been amazing.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Rob. And I must say, whenever I feel I might be slipping into a funk, I often think I need another conversation with Rob. So you're that person for me.
I'm always here for you. If you ever need a convo, I'm always here. You let me know.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to the next one. And yes, definitely, let's have a conversation about Plato. He's one of my favorite people in the world.
Awesome. Awesome. So with that being said, everybody out there, below in the description are all of Paul's website, his YouTube channel, subscribe, and Fifth Kind TV. You can find all of Paul's work throughout the website and on YouTube here. And you can go purchase his books from his website as well. It is definitely worth your while in spades, those books, and get them into your library. We are the Forever Student family. We're going to keep progressing this information. We're going to keep bringing people on that know how to further our investment in who we are. Paul is one of those people, 110%. And again, thank you, Paul. And from us here to you out there, I hope everybody has a great rest of the evening.